symbol for the blood. Jesus took the wine cup, no blood in it. He says, this is the blood. This is my blood, which is shed for you, he says. In other words, think of it as my blood. And drink it. And partake of me. Partake of my life. Partake of my spiritual life. Partake of what I am. Just like a man believes if he drank the blood of an ox, he'll become like strong like an ox. You believe that by partaking of me, you'll become like me. Partake of me, he says. So the Bible never recommends drinking of blood and so on. But they practiced it in that way. Some tribes practiced it in that way. They drank the blood and then they, after they're drinking the blood, they shook hands. And the shaking of hands today is like, this is your hand and this is my hand. We bring it together and we just shake it, right? Then there in those days, they took the hand and brought the wrist and wrist together so that the bloods mingled. This is how they shook their hands. I would go and shake your hands, go deep into your hands so that my wrist touches your wrist. That's the way they shook their hands because they wanted the bloods to mingle. And this was also important to them, and they became blood brothers. From that time, they became blood brothers. It meant a lot to them. It meant that they cannot turn against each other. They cannot do anything against one another. They cannot cheat one another. You see, it was a covenant. It was a blood covenant, you see. It was a blood covenant. The cup which was filled with their blood, they drank. And when they drank it, it meant to them that they have partaken of one another and they've become one with the other. So that if they do something against the other, they are doing it against themselves. That's the way they thought about it, you see. Even today, sometimes you find in the wedding ceremonies, they have communion. And have you ever wondered why they have communion? Some people think it's just a tradition in some churches that they have communion. But it has a meaning. What they're saying is that the wedding is not just a legal thing where by the law of the state you're joined together as husband and wife with two witnesses and you signing. Two witnesses and you signing satisfies the law of the state. You become husband and wife. But the wedding in the eyes of God is much more than that. It is a covenant. It is not just a legal contract. It is a covenant. Because it is a covenant, they ask you to lift the cup together. They ask you to take the bread and eat it together and lift the cup together, because you are not only just becoming partners together in a legal contract, you are bound together by a covenant which cannot be broken. A blood covenant. A blood covenant that was put into effect by the cross of Calvary through Jesus Christ. And you take the cup that signifies that blood covenant and you say, I enter into a covenant like that with you. Now, then there is no place for separation, no place for divorce, no place to say you go to your mother's house and I'll go to my mother's house and all that nonsense, Once you do that, you're bound by a covenant. Whether you like or not, you stay together. And better start liking one another and working out things with one another and do something to make it work. There is no way out because it is a covenant relationship. It is like a blood covenant. That is why they have the communion, even though it is not explained in so many words, people just drink the cup and, eat the bread and you go through the ceremony, don't understand what it means. But actually, this is what it means, Back in the old days, they say, even the ring came from that kind of a practice, where nowadays we conveniently just wear a ring. And if it's a ring, sometimes if your wife doesn't like you, I've seen in some countries, they'll just take the ring and throw it in your face and say, get out of here, you and your ring, It can happen to you sometimes. I'm afraid that it happens in India also sometimes. Very easy to take the ring and throw it. But, you know how the ring came? they say in those days, when they cut the covenant, they made an incision like a ring in the ring finger. When they made incisions in those days, they say they put gunpowder so that the place where the incision was made, the mark is pronounced. It is prominent. It will be seen. It will look like a ring where they cut you. I think it's better to do that even today. You can't leave that ring at home. Some guys take their ring and put it in their pocket when they go to some parties, because they want to look like they're unmarried, You can never get rid of that ring because that is a permanent mark on your body, you see. That has now become a ring where we conveniently take it off and put it back, and when you throw your ring at the face of your husband, he goes and marries another one and gives the same ring to that one, Save some money, It means very little these days, Marriage has lost its meaning. Marriage has become just an ordinary legal contract that you can cancel any time that you don't like, and so on, because people have failed to understand that it is a covenant. Marriage is a covenant and not just a legal contract. Now, there are some interesting historical stories about the sacredness of the blood covenant as practiced by people everywhere in the world. I'm sure you've heard about David Livingstone, who worked in Africa. And there was another man named Stanley who went looking for him, back in the 1800s. In the 1800s, you can't just go to Google and Google the guy, if you're looking for the guy. It's very difficult to look for a guy. So when Stanley and Livingstone went into Africa and Stanley went looking for him, it was a big exploration and had to go through a lot of trouble and found out many things. And they talk about, one thing that they talk about in their explorations of Africa is about the blood covenant. They talk about it with wonder. These British men, they could hardly understand why this covenant meant so much for the African people, They were in amazement about why this covenant meant so much to the African people. They say, both of them say, that they've never found one man in Africa who has ever broken a blood covenant. Not one man. If he was ever there, he will not be living today. If he broke the covenant, he'll be dead, That's the way it is. Blood covenant was a serious business. It was very sacred. The vilest enemies became closest friends, most trusted friends, as soon as the covenant is cut. No man takes advantage of the covenant or breaks it. It is so sacred that the children to the third and fourth generations revere it and keep it. It was a perpetual covenant. It was indissoluble. And a covenant that cannot be annulled, cannot be cancelled. It cannot be dissolved. It cannot be cancelled. This is what they say about it. And they are in wonder about it. They talk about it with wonder about their exploration. The thing about the covenant is the most prominent thing about their discovery that they made about Africa, the blood covenant. Now, if you read Stanley's stories about how he went to look for Livingstone, he talks about all the problems he had. First of all, when he set out to go looking for the man, he went out with a few others, because he couldn't go alone. He carried some things because they had to sell some things to make some money, to buy some food, and you have to find a living also, make a living also on the way, because it takes months and months and years to explore and to find out. So when they went, they found out that every step was a hurdle to them. Everywhere they went, there were tribes that were hostile, that were warlike, that always wanted to fight them, stop them, did not want to cooperate with them, did not want to help them, and so on. They will leave the stuff there, somebody will steal half of the stuff, You turn this way, by the time some of the things will be stolen, Always somebody has to watch over their stuff. They were looting their stuff and stealing their stuff and not cooperating and always working against them and so on. So there was an interpreter with him who was an African, educated in England. He knew both customs. And he told Stanley, finally, he said, why don't you make a blood covenant? And Stanley did not understand the significance of the blood covenant as it was practiced in Africa. He said, what do you mean blood covenant? What does it mean? What should I do in order to make a blood covenant? He said, you got to drink one another's blood. He said, no, not me. I'm an Englishman. I don't drink nobody's blood, you know. We're civilized people. We don't practice such things. And we won't do such things. So he refused to do that and went on trying to explore and trying to find Livingstone and met with failure after failure after failure. And finally they met with a very horrible tribe where the chieftain was a very horrible man. And they could not handle him. And finally this man, the interpreter, again told him, I'm telling you, Stanley, make a blood covenant, then you'll find some favor. Stanley looked at him and said, tell me what is the benefit of the blood covenant? What will blood covenant get to me? How will I benefit from a blood covenant? And that man looked up to him and said, when you make a blood covenant with that chief, that terrible fellow, everything that he has will become yours. Then Stanley started thinking. He said, my goodness, everything that guy has will become mine? That's a good deal. That's what I want. I want his fullest cooperation. I want his favor. I want everything from him. So let's make the blood covenant, they said. So they decided to make the blood covenant. There were two groups. One is Stanley's group. The other is the other tribe with the tribal chief and all of that. They had to choose a representative. So they chose a representative. Stanley chose a representative and put him up. And the other man, the chieftain, chose a representative and he put him up also. Those two people are going to now cut the covenant. Before it happened, the first session was, Stanley was questioned. Who are you? The chief asked. Where are you coming from? What kind of a man are you? Are you going to be able to keep the covenant? Are you going to be faithful and truthful to this? He examined him thoroughly. And then after he was satisfied, then there was an exchanging of gifts. And Stanley was a very naive person, you know, he didn't know anything about this. So he just looked over and saw some of the stuff that these Africans had and he said, all right, I'll take that and I'll take this and so on. And they were ready to give him that. But the chieftain was a very clever guy. He's a very experienced guy in making covenants. He looked over and he found that this man had a nice white goat. Now the reason he had a white goat, Stanley had a white goat, was he could not eat the African food. So he had a stomach ulcer. The only thing that he could eat now was goat's milk. So he got a goat and carried it everywhere and milked it and drank its milk. That was his only food that he can eat. And the chieftain understood that this meant so much for Stanley and he said, I want that. And the guy told the interpreter, tell him to ask for anything else, man. Tell him that my stomach can't take their food and I need this goat and this goat's milk is the only thing that I can eat, you know. I can't give this goat, I'll give anything else. I got so much stuff. Why don't you want this trinket and why don't you want these clothes? Why can't you want this, all this stuff that I got? Why do you want the goat? He said, because that goat is your life. Because that goat is so important to you, I want it. You want to make a covenant with me, you give me the thing that matters to you most. Give it to me, he said. Finally, the interpreter said, you better give him the goat because the guy won't leave you without giving the goat. You know, it's not going to happen. Give it to him. So finally, he gave the goat, you know. Here goes his food, you know. Gave the goat to the guy. And the guy was happy to get the goat. And he turned around and he took a stick wound with copper wire and gave it to Stanley. And Stanley looked at the interpreter and said, this is what I get for a goat? A stick? Man, these Africans are giving me a very bad deal, you know. I just get a stick and he gets my goat, he gets my food and I just get a stick. But he came to understand how powerful this stick was when he began to travel with that stick and entered into tribe after tribe, among people after people. Whenever they saw this stick, everybody bowed before him